If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. What is the most terrifying paranormal encounter or experience you've had with demons, shadow figures, or other supernatural entities? When me and my brother were about 6 and 7, we lived on a farm. We had a forest next to us, so the trees would drop the brook-like branches. The sun was setting, and we were picking up those branches to make witches' brooms for Halloween. He was crouched on the ground, and I was standing. I had a feeling there was something looking at me, which was pretty normal. Usually it's a deer. So I turned in the direction of our tall grass field that me and my brother weren't allowed to go in because of ticks, and instead of a deer, I saw a woman. Very, very tall. Like unearthly tall. She had a bob-like haircut. But because the sun was setting, she was just a silhouette. I couldn't make out her face. A few seconds later her body dropped into the tall grass where she wasn't visible, and at that moment all I thought was run. Our house had 9 acres of land, we were about 7 acres away. I grabbed him and screamed run while crying. Usually he'll fight me, but by the sound in my voice, he clung to my hand, and we ran. All the way down the hill, 7 acres. Neither of us looked back. We got in the house, and my grandfather, who usually is fed up with us and thinks we're playing, genuinely has never seen us so scared that he went and searched the whole farm. He found nothing, but me and my brother still don't know what it was. We no longer live there. I was part of a paranormal club back in college. Our university was old and had its share of grim history and urban legends, like how bodies from a nearby flood used the then parking lot as a makeshift morgue, or the hidden underground morgue of the now medical wing now turned into the computer sciences department. And the ghosts in the school bathroom lore. One evening we decided to walk the long path to the East Campus entrance after class. It was a quiet but dark walk through the old campus and the forest area. We weren't particularly ghost hunting, just me and my then crush and his buddy walking back to the dorms. We talked about each urban legend associated with the areas we passed. All of a sudden, his buddy trailed behind and started screaming. At first we thought we were playing around till we saw his face full of terror, eyes bulging, and him scratching at his throat. Then his buddy came for us. Me and my crush ran. I hesitated a bit, yelling at my crush to go get his friend back, to which he replied, "No, it's too late. He's gone." Typical horror movie fashion, I fell while running and was swooped up by my crush princess style and made a mad dash to the safety of the gymnasium. His buddy caught up with us, and my crush was ready to beat the crap out of him in case he was possessed. I was a crying, scared mess. Turns out, Buddy walked right straight into a big cobweb made by fruit spiders and obstructed both his vision, and he ended up inhaling a good amount, hence the while screaming and scratching at his throat thing. He actually got into a fight with my crush about their friendship since Buddy felt he got abandoned. Though the story may not be paranormal, for those 5 minutes, we felt we were in some serious Friday the 13th type scenario. Paranormal related though. The old photography room of the school had stories of the Black Lady. During one class, the girls decided to do an impromptu EVP session where they caught hissing noises. One claimed they actually saw the Black Lady looming above our classmate and fainted out of fear. The scariest experience for me was at my cousin's house. I would go over all the time to play computer games with my cousin in the living room. We were there so often that his mom put an air mattress there for me to sleep in since he slept on the couch. Well, one late night we were up around 4 a.m. The computer was set up facing a wall, and the dining room was to the left of the computer or was an open space from the living room to the dining room. Well, I was busy playing Paperboy, and I heard my cousin get really quiet. I started to say something when he told me not to move. He told me to quietly get up and walk slowly to my cousin Pearl's bedroom. I asked him why, and he told me to look at the sofa. Mind you, the sofa is facing the TV in the back of the house, and the computer is towards the front of the house, so all I could see would be the back of the sofa. Well, when I turned to see it, it looked like someone was sitting on the sofa. Everyone in the house is asleep, and all the lights are off except for the computer. I did as he said, and the closer I got to the bedroom, the longer I would walk. I looked back to see if there was something behind me. In the doorway to the hall that leads to the bedrooms was a person standing facing us. We ran into the room and locked ourselves in. I did not sleep that night. So one night my wife, son, and I went to stay over at my wife's parents' house. It had gotten dark and my son, about 2 at the time, got sleepy, so I decided to put him to bed. Let me try to explain the room to you. The door opens on the right side of the room, immediately to your left is the light switch, and the queen-size bed is just beside that. It's a small room, just big enough for the bed and enough room to walk around it. The wall in front of the bed has a window. A closet with peculiar accordion doors is located to the left of the bed. I'm lying in bed with the lights out with my son, who is laying his head on my arm. He finally falls asleep, and I just lie there for a few minutes to make sure he is completely out. Then, out of nowhere, I get this horrible feeling, goosebumps, hair standing up on my neck and arms. It was such an evil feeling. Have you ever got goosebumps up your scalp where it feels like your scalp is shrinking? I did that night, so bad in fact it literally felt like someone had a hand on my head squeezing it. I was genuinely scared. Not so much for me, but for my son. Somehow I knew deep down that if I turn away from my son, something terrible will happen to him. I thought if I could turn on the light, I could grab my son and leave the room. So where I was on the bed, I could just barely touch the plastic bezel thing on the light switch. I was afraid to move because I knew if I did whatever this thing was, it would get my son. His head was on my arm this whole time. So I finally chanced it. I jerked my arm out from my son and turned on the light. It honestly took a split second. When I turned back to grab him, he was at the bottom of the mattress, like something had pulled him from the top to the bottom in a split freaking second. And I know he didn't crawl down there because he was still fast asleep. So I grabbed him up, and we left the room and slept in the front room that night. Something evil wanted my child. That is truly terrifying. Camped at Polihale State Park on Kauai. After being trapped on the beach during a 5-hour torrential rainstorm, my wife and I tried dozing off. At this point, it was 1 a.m. the second our heads hit the pillow, we felt footsteps around our tent. Whatever it was, and we could tell it was multiple beings, human, animal, whatever, was circling our tent, making animal noises, and flashing lights all around and into our tent. We didn't want to engage. We felt their intentions were very bad. Long story short, they harassed us literally all night until the sun came up. Every single time we made any sort of noise or shifted in our tent, the noises would get louder and more aggressive. Everything inside the tent was drenched from the storm. We didn't get a single minute of sleep all night. It was the worst night of our lives. We literally thought we were going to die. Once we got home, we looked into it and found countless stories of people's interactions with Hawaii's night marchers. I love Kauai, but that kind of ruined camping for me. So back in 1995, I was 12, I finally decided to play Ouija with my dad. I should preface that my dad used to do a lot of seances and other occult things like tarot. As a result, he had some pretty unsettling encounters he told me about. Anyways, we go through the game and we ask the usual questions, and I distinctly remember how unusual the movements of the glass piece felt. It didn't feel like controlled natural movements. Later that night we started watching TV, and I kept seeing these little green human-shaped figures pop up in the corner of my eye, and when I tried to look directly at them as usual, nothing was there. This goes on for about 5 minutes, and my dad starts laughing and says, "You see them too, huh?" I thought he was trying to scare me, so instead of telling him what exactly I saw, I said, "See what?" He laughs again and says, "Those little green guys." This comment was one of the scariest things I experienced to this day, and I never touched Ouija again. That last piece of this story involves going outside with him so he could smoke, and our black inside/outside cat hissed at us in the house and jumped off the van and ran off down the neighborhood and didn't come back until the following afternoon. He also knew something was seriously wrong. People say Ouija is fake, but depending on who is using it, their openness, and location, I think it opens areas that shouldn't be opened. It has been almost 30 years, and that moment still sticks with me, and I have never considered that game again. I am an American, 29, and my husband is Swiss, 32. 2 years ago we moved to Zurich, and we decided to take a little vacation in the Alps with our kids and my husband's parents. We rented an old but charming chalet with a breathtaking view of the mountains. The kind of view where you think, nothing bad could ever happen in a place this beautiful. It turns out things weren't so simple. The first day, I immediately felt like someone was watching me from my room there. That night I heard several knocks on the wall but assumed it was from the old walls breathing. The second night, the knocking started happening when I would enter my room during the day. On our third night there, as I was going to bed, I saw what looked like the shadow of a large person passing by our window. The only problem with this is that our window was on the top floor, so someone walking around outside in front of it was impossible. I decided to ignore that and went to sleep feeling this heavy, dark feeling. It was really strange. Well, I woke up in the middle of the night. When I opened my eyes, I saw a man sitting on the end of my bed with his hair styled in a very particular way and with a suit that had a collar and lapels styled in a way I have never observed before on any photo or on anyone in person, and his suit even had a pocket watch with a chain. His skin was gray and almost translucent. He was staring at me, and it felt like a tangible hatred was in the air. He was just staring at me with his hands on his lap. I was so ducking terrified I closed my eyes for a few seconds. When I opened them, he had a bedsheet over him and was slowly turning his head more towards me, and I know this sounds weird, but it was almost like I knew he was trying to scare me. At that point, I started screaming and woke my husband up. The man I saw was gone. It was around 4 a.m. or so, and I told him maybe I am crazy, but I am not spending one more second in that house, and I literally went outside and sat on the patio until the sun came up. Once my in-laws were awake, I asked my father-in-law, who is a pastor, to please pray over the place, and things seemed to die down after that, though I definitely can say I still felt watched but no longer threatened. I ended up Googling later if there were any haunted areas near where we stayed, and it turns out there were several reviews on Google for the chalets on both sides of ours reporting their chalets being haunted and having something holding them down at night and walking back and forth in their rooms, so take of that what you will. I just wanted to share my experience because it stuck with me since it happened, and, well, I never share it because I don't want people to think I'm nuts. Thanks for listening if you made it this far. The house I grew up in had an entity, demon, or spirit of some kind. My parents were aware but didn't tell me all the details until I grew up. The entity was in the kitchen mostly and would open drawers and cabinet doors and rattle things around. As a family, we usually went to visit family friends on Friday or Saturday night, and when we got home, I waited in the car with my mom while my dad checked out the house to make sure it was safe. I thought all dads did that. This was a Southern California early 70s low-crime area. My dad would come back out, and we would all go in. I later learned that while we were gone the entity would open up all drawers and cabinets in the kitchen and my dad would close everything up to make my mom feel better. My bedroom was next to the kitchen, and that explained why I would hear silverware rattling on and off all night most nights for years. I thought one of my parents was getting a snack or cleaning up. When I was about 8 years old, one night it was especially loud in the kitchen, and I had trouble going to sleep. It was suddenly silent, too quiet, and I realized that someone was in my room. I have never felt such fear. My bed was up against a wall, and I was lying facing it, curled up. I pretended to be asleep, but I was also ready to start screaming at the top of my lungs, but I knew that if I opened my mouth, nothing would come out. I was paralyzed with fear. All of a sudden the entity was right next to me and said, "Little girl, I know you're awake," and gave an evil laugh. I can still hear his voice. So, about a year ago, I started seeing a fuzzy figure of a small girl standing at the foot of my bed almost every night. She scared the crap out of me, and every night I would lay there and just stare at her as she watched me. She never did anything else, she just stood there, but I could feel her watching me. She never appeared as a full figure, but I know she is a little over 4 feet tall, and she always wears a blue summer dress with sunflowers. Her hazel-colored hair goes halfway down her back, no bangs and middle part. Her eyes are dark brown. About 3 months into the sightings, I saw the figure's family. There was a mother who was standing at the right side of the bed while the girl was on the left, and the father sat in my desk chair that is to the left of my bed. They were all fuzzy figures, as the girl always is. I never saw the family again. A while later, the girl disappeared for a week or two. I thought she was gone, and my parents never believed that the girl was ever there, as she doesn't like adults. Then she appeared again, this time right next to my pillow on the right side of the bed. I wonder if she ever left because I only checked the foot of the bed. The only reason I knew she moved was because I woke up, checked the foot of the bed, and then rolled onto my side and saw her. I don't believe she intends to harm me, she is just there. What makes it worse is that whenever I bring my parents, she disappears, and she doesn't appear on camera. It was around 2015 when this happened. It was 10 p.m. and I was walking home from my grandparents' house to my house. My house was directly in front of my grandparents' house at the time, maybe not even 20 feet apart. My grandma was on the porch saying goodbye after we had talked for a bit. I started walking down the steps, and I heard a very strange sound. I've never found proper words to describe the sound. The closest I can get is horse hooves on a window. It sent shivers down my spine. My grandma played it off, so I continued walking. At this point she had gone in the house. I was halfway home when I looked down the yard. At the end of my grandparents' house stood a tall, hairy humanoid creature. It was about 10 feet. It was huge and covered in reddish-brown hair. It resembled a human in shape and features, but it just wasn't human. It started walking towards me. I couldn't move. It only walked maybe 6 feet before stopping. I just stared at it, and it stared at me. It wasn't moving, so I ran towards my house as fast as I could. When I got on my porch, I looked back, and it had started walking back to the end of my grandparents' house again. A few nights later, my mom was watching me walk to my grandparents' house. I didn't see anything and got there safely. My mom told me that she saw the same thing at the end of my grandparents' house. She said it was standing outside of my uncle's window. It looked at her, and she looked at it, but it didn't move from its spot. She described it in the same ways as I did. We researched things together but never found anything like it. After that, maybe 2 to 3 days go by, and my dad was outside at around 9 p.m. He was making sure he locked the car. When he was out there, he saw it standing under a motion light we had in the yard between our houses. He also described it in the same way. He said it didn't acknowledge him, but he quickly went back inside. The day after that, my uncle left, and for the rest of our years living there, we didn't see it again. My uncle's room was at the end of my grandparents' house. He's not a good person, and there are a few other stories about things like this when he was around plus his own story. My parents and I are sure it was there because of him, but it's still so creepy to think about. I've never found any creature resembling this since. I'm sorry if my description of it is bad. I'm not sure how to describe it. If anyone has any similar stories, I'd love to hear them, and if you have any ideas, I'd love to know. I've always been a believer, my family has too. I have lots of stories to tell. The world is a mysterious place. I was an amateur ghost hunter in my early 20s. One year, 3 friends and I paid $400 to rent the Valisca axe murder house for the night. We flew to Iowa, got there around midnight, and set up our equipment, EVP recorders in every room, a camera in the upstairs children's room, and a shadow box in the living room. We also inspected the house thoroughly for drafts and tampering, magnetic areas, anything attached to doors, anything that could be remotely manipulated. The place was completely still and quiet, aside from the roar of a train going by every hour on the hour that rattled the house and drowned everything out. For the first few hours, nothing happened. We looked around the house, hung out in the barn out back a little bit, and just periodically checked out equipment. Finally, around 3 to 4 a.m., our camera started picking things up. First, there was a loud knocking in the closet in the children's room. Creaking and slamming in the background. Loud footsteps on the stairs. None of us were in the house. We would go to the barn for half an hour and come back to check our equipment. Then doors started opening. First only on camera, the children's closet door and the attic door. Opening and shutting repeatedly. Then, when we were inside, the doors began to open and close right in front of us. We stepped into the attic at one point, and a loud human-like growl came from the corner. There was nothing in there. We noped out hard and never stepped foot over that threshold again. There was a ball in the living room that would roll across a completely level floor right in front of us from a standstill. It moved naturally, not in a straight line. It would go in circles. I could also occasionally feel breath on the back of my neck. My friend heard a growl right next to her ear. While everything was unsettling, I think the worst thing that we picked up was an EVP from the downstairs bedroom. A little girl's voice very clearly said, "It hurts, it hurts." That was the only EVP we got, aside from some growling. The place was so foreboding and negative, I will never go back. I'm glad I went, though. It was quite the experience. I used to work at a mental hospital, which was once an old tuberculosis hospital. I used to date a coworker, and since we live far apart, we would sit in our cars and just talk after work. One night, it was cold and drizzling outside, and I was reclining in my seat, looking up through the sunroof, just staring at the rain. Slowly but steadily, a handprint on the sunroof started to show. I assumed it was always there and the oil from my hands that was never wiped or something. But when I put my hand next to it, the handprint was child-sized, and it was from inside the car. I don't have kids, and no child has ever been in my car. Just as it appeared, it slowly faded away. That's just one of the things I couldn't explain. One other time I saw a doppelganger of my coworker in broad daylight sitting at her desk, and when I started talking to her, she just disappeared, and at the same time said coworker walked in the main office to clock in. Help identifying the entity attached to the women on my mother's side of the family. So, as a precursor, my grandmother's home was originally a coal camp house, 1 bedroom, 1 bath, living room, and kitchen. As a child, her father died in the mines he worked in, and they got a large amount of money. They built onto the house. Many paranormal things have occurred here. The most troublesome thing that has continued occurring is the appearance of a toddler-sized entity. It does not look transparent or ghostly. It looks as real as me or you. It has bright red hair and a toddler-sized body. What's unsettling is that it has adult facial features. The first time I saw it, I was 14 and just starting puberty. One day I was sitting in my grandmother's living room. It was just me and her in the house. Out of my peripheral vision, I saw it. It crawled from the edge of my vision from behind my chair and just crawled to the center of the room. It stopped in the middle and turned its head to smile at me. Then it crawled into a hallway, and upon looking, it was nowhere to be found. Its occurrences follow this pattern. It never speaks, never crawls towards you. Only away. It only happens when there are only women in the house. My grandmothers came into the room after I looked for where it went. I know I was sickly white. I can't explain the feeling that came over me when this happened. I was frozen with pure terror, and my mind felt almost clouded with confusion. When she saw me, she said, "So you finally saw it." She explained that all the women in the family see it every now and then and that it won't hurt me. She warned me not to approach it or speak to it when I see it. Just see it, then ignore it. According to her, her own mother saw it as well as herself and my mother. I'm now 21 and don't know a lot about our family history, but I'm wondering if anyone has had experiences with entities of this kind. I know that our ancestry is largely Irish/Scottish but not much else. The thing only happens in her house, thank goodness. Any information would be greatly appreciated. This happened when I was around 11. At the time, I had neighbors that owned this beautiful brick house that was over 100 years old. It was 2 stories tall and used to be owned by the Amish. They had completely remodeled it. They installed a bathroom on both the first and second floors. There were 2 barns, a chicken coop, and the whole package. The property definitely came chock full of history. My neighbors also had a daughter that was a couple years older than me, and we became close friends. I would go over to their house nearly every day. I would go all through the old barns, play on both levels of the house, and have the most fun. Nothing about the property scared me. In fact, I thought it felt more like home than my own house. That is, until one day during the summer. We, my neighbors and I, were all outside enjoying the weather. I really had to go to the bathroom, so I ran to the house due to being quite a distance away. I always preferred using the upstairs bathroom. The stairs were steep due to how old the house was, and it was always fun for me to run up them. I walked through the kitchen and got to the base of the steps. I looked to the top of the stairs, and there he was. The memory of him is so fresh in my mind. He was a solid figure at the top of the stairs. He was an older man, with white hair on the sides of his head and no hair on top. A black suit with no wrinkles, no fuzz, perfectly in order. Shiny white dress shoes with black accents. Not a single smudge. I looked up to his face. The feeling I got then when I saw his face is the same feeling I get now. Pure terror. His expression was angry. His eyes were black. Not any shade of black I have yet to see again. The depth of his eyes felt like an eternity. I have never felt evil like that before. Seeing him, I knew that this was no random intruder. I could feel him. His presence was tangible. I knew he was not human. When I finally regained my senses, I ran out of the house screaming. I have never screamed like that before. I told my neighbors what had happened, and they immediately went into the house because they believed there was an intruder. Of course, nobody was found. I refused to go to the second story of that house alone again. I haven't seen him since. I know he was not a ghost or some vengeful spirit. He was the embodiment of evil. I assume what I saw was demonic. Whatever he is, I hope I never see him again for the rest of my life. This incident occurred when I was 13 years old. It was 2013-14 at the time. I was attending a middle school in my hometown in Utah and had worked after school in something they called the Peer Leadership Program. We were working on an anti-bullying campaign for School Spirit Week, and I was charged with making the banner. At the time, I had set up in the hallway. The layout, very important, of the hallway I was in was on the second floor. Directly in front of me was a staircase that led to the first floor and what we called the catacombs of the school. Below the school is a bunch of tunnels that network all around the little town. There were many rumors about why, but the thing the teachers told us was they were dug during the Cold War. I should also add that there had been a bunch of weird things to happen at the entrance. It was always locked during school hours, but there had been reports going around about wet human hair being found in the basement right outside of the door, knocking coming from the other side, and screaming that happened at night, according to one custodian from inside the catacombs. Directly to the right of the staircase was a dead-end hallway. There were only 3 classrooms on each side of the T-shaped hall, and they were all remedial-type classes, making them extremely small. It was about 4:30 at the time, and most of the teachers had already gone home. The only people in the hallway were myself and 2 other girls who were in the T-shaped hall working on posters. I was more of a recluse, especially when I work, so I didn't really want to sit with anyone or anyone seeing my banner until it was done. I was in the middle of painting this giant beast of a banner when I heard a giggle, so I looked up towards the stairs just in time to see a little girl with blonde hair run around the corner into the hallway. She couldn't have been more than 10. For some reason it gave me a very uneasy feeling watching her, so for a couple of seconds I just stared into the hallway. That's when she peeked her head back out and darted right back. It was almost like she didn't want me to see her. It took everything in me to make myself stand up and walk around the corner to see who or what she was, but when the hallway came fully into view, I just saw my fellow students extremely focused on drawing their respective posters. Neither of them had blonde hair. No little girl was with them. "Did you see a girl come around this corner?" I remember asking, and one of the girls said, "Well yeah, you did," and laughed. I proceeded to explain what I had seen. They were both adamant that no one had come into the hallway before I did. Just in case, I went around checking all the doors, and they were all locked tight. I was freaking out, and I could tell that it was freaking them out, so we all decided to just call it a day and go home afterwards. Posters and banners be damned, I still don't know what it was. I want to say it was a ghost, but she looked too real for that. Like I could actually reach out and touch her. That, and I've had my fair share of hauntings at home in my own house, stories for another day. So the fact that the spirit of a little girl would make my hair stand on end and my heart drop was extremely weird to me. Does anyone know what this could be? Could it be connected to the wet hair that was found years prior? Why couldn't anyone else see her? Why was I filled with immense dread when she ran by? I've only shared this story with those closest to me, but every time I go back to it, fear twists my gut, and I get goosebumps and tears welling up in my eyes. Before I tell you about it, a little background on me. At the time, I'm 40 years old, married with 2 children, enjoy walking, nature, and the mountains, and take photos when the weather permits. I'm not religious, and I try to hold on to Cartesian thinking. This evening of August 22, 2017, all the indicators are green to go and take photos of the Milky Way in the mountains. I'm hoping to get some nice shots with fir trees. At 10 p.m., I throw my gear in my trunk and head up to a village 30 minutes away. Arriving at Bullet, everything's set up, but the weather decides to play a trick on me, and the sky is filled with high-altitude clouds. It's not the first time, and after a look at the satellite animations a little further on, the sky seems more cooperative. I take to the road again, heading for La Creu du Van, a well-known geological cirque in the region where I live. When I arrive near the parking lot that leads to the path to get there, I'm greeted by numerous flashing lights, police, fire department, ambulance, everyone is there, at the top of the mountain, in the middle of the forest. I'm stopped and questioned about my presence, and I explain why I want to go up there. The police explain that the site is not accessible and ask me to leave. I'm getting worn out and decide to go home, empty-handed, but that's for another time. A shiver runs down my spine. I've been driving through the forest for a few minutes, then I come to a clearing, driving slowly for fear of running over nocturnal animals. And there, in my headlights, he's there. At the side of the road. It's there. My eyes are riveted to his. I'll only see him for a few seconds in the end, the time it takes to overtake the car, but it feels like an eternity. He's tall, very tall, over 2 meters. He's also very thin, sickly skinny, and his skin is as white as a full sledge, completely naked. He has a little black hair that's tousled on his head. His arms are crossed over his chest, immense fingers dangling from the tips of his hands. And he's covered in blood, everywhere. He follows me with his eyes. His eyes stared into mine. I'm overcome by primal fear. My whole body is screaming at me to flee, to get away as fast as I can. It's as if my survival instinct is begging me to get as far away from here as possible. By reflex, I mash the gas pedal and drive at breakneck speed to reach the edge of the lake and leave this forest that oppresses me. I keep looking in the rearview mirror, unaware of the danger I'm exposing myself to by driving at this speed. The tears of fear streaming down my face are absolutely uncontrollable. I'm terrified to the core, like a 5-year-old whose light has gone out in a cellar. When I finally reach the edge of the lake, I pull over to the side of the road and try to regain my composure. Clinging to reality and the rationality that has always built my life like a lifeline, I feel like I'm going mad. I'm thinking that maybe someone had a car accident and was in distress, but I didn't stop to help. I hate myself for having reacted badly and for having been overwhelmed by unreasonable fear. So I call the police, still breathing hard. I tell them who I am, that I haven't been drinking or taking drugs, and that they'll probably think I'm crazy. But no, they're benevolent and listen to me all the way. I finally get home, and my fear explodes in my belly. This look never leaves me, piercing me again. I tell him what happened to me and start crying again. 2 hours later, at 3 a.m., the police rang my doorbell. There are 3 of them, and they're obviously taking this very seriously. They ask me for more details about the time and place. Luckily, I know the place perfectly well and give them the GPS coordinates of what happened. The next day, the Creu du Van, where I was heading, made headlines in the local papers. 2 people had died there in the middle of the night in a microlight accident. With no news from the police after several days, I contacted them and also learned that a carcass had also been found several kilometers away with no one at the wheel, but that I had done the right thing by not stopping. I'll never hear the end of it. I'm now 47 years old, and I've been back to the Crew du Van many times, day and night, because it's a place I love. I've always found it challenging to believe in the supernatural, even though I'm convinced that many things go beyond our understanding of the world and shatter our certainties. 10 to 12-year-old me and a friend take a walk to our little nature reserve. An oasis in the middle of the city, a forest area fenced off and untouched. Surrounded by housing and a brewery, you wouldn't know it was there if you drove past it. Me and most of my friends would spend a lot of free time in there, the Frida. Why it was called that I still don't know. We would camp out there and tell our families we were sleeping at each other's houses. Tall old oak trees, lots of nettles to get stung by, and a few algae-covered large ponds. It was always very damp in there, even in the summer. One weekend morning we hopped the fence at our usual spot and walked the trail through a large plot of stingers/nettles, which had been worn from constant use by us and other kids. While walking through, I swing a hard left off the trail and straight into the stingers. I keep walking with my friend, following. "Where you going?" he calls. I keep walking for a couple of minutes, and we reach a tree in an area that normally no one would go to because of the amount of stingers/nettles that had to be navigated through. The tree, not sure that type, but not an oak and not very tall compared. We both stop right in front of this tree. It has a hole in the trunk at about head height. Of 10 to 12-year-old me, the hole into the tree looks more like a wound, like someone had the skin ripped off and the wound was healing at the edges. I look into the hole. The inside is hollow and burnt out, just black ash with what looks like a white face staring back at me. I move back, and Kevin looks in the hole. He sees the face, he looks at me. I look at him, ducking speechless. The white face, I really can't describe it any better, looked a little bit like a generic type movie alien, a gray, I think they might be called. It looked like it was drawn on but not drawn on and slightly raised from the ash. We don't say a word and start to walk back through the stingers, then run the duck out of the Frida. We avoided the Frida for a couple of weeks/no more than a month. When we finally get the balls to go back, we go look for the tree again and find that the hole has closed up. You could see where the hole was, like it had healed, like an eye that was shut but vertically, not horizontally. It was definitely the same tree. We looked around just in case, but no, it was definitely the same tree. We noped the duck out of there again. Now, the face in the tree could have been drawn by someone? I have heard of trees burning, starting from underground fires that spread through the roots and into the trunk, but not in the UK and not somewhere where the ground is so damp. The tree also still had leaves on its branches, the first time we saw it and the second time, but it was definitely burned out on the inside. How the duck did that hole heal in a matter of weeks? It was big enough to stick your head in. How could it have healed so quickly? It was definitely the same tree. Last year, while at a funeral, I saw my old friend after 22 years. We exchanged pleasantries. I ask, "Kev, do you remember that tree? Did that really happen?" He replies, "Yes, it did happen. I moved into a house when I was 13, and I had a dark shadow hold me down one morning not long after we moved in. 2 people died on the property, which I knew about moving in, and several people died while we lived there in front of the house, which sat on a corner with a stop sign that many people, I guess, ignored, or they were blinded. I don't know. But on average we had about 3 car accidents a year, and one year we had 6, so there is no telling how many people died before we moved there. A lot of things happened on that property, and I believe it was the property because years later, when I got married, my husband and I moved a new double-wide mobile home into the property, and it was like it followed me into that home as well, but whatever it was, it still haunted my parents' place. We lived there in the double-wide for 8 years, and when we moved into our first house, it all stopped for me, so I believe it was property. My parents, on the other hand, still had to deal with heavy footsteps at night and my dad's rocker recliner rocking on its own, etc. My older sister, who was already married when we moved there, was always skeptical, and she used to laugh at me and anyone else who claimed the place was haunted. She, her husband, and 2 kids were moving into a house that wasn't ready yet, so they needed a place to stay for a little while, and they temporarily moved into the double-wide. She wasn't there a week when she woke up with a black shadow standing over her, and she couldn't move or scream. She said that when it finally disappeared, she jumped from the bed, screaming and waking everyone up. What's weird is that I had told her about many things that happened at that place, but I never told her about the black shadow holding me down because I had always thought what I experienced that morning was sleep paralysis. Neither one of us had ever experienced anything like that before then, and we haven't since then. I know a lot of people believe that these black shadows are just sleep paralysis, and maybe some of them are. But not all of them are, and after that happened to her, I believe that more than ever, it was one of the spirits haunting that property that held us both down. I've had a slew of experiences throughout my life. Many left me feeling very excited and happy to have had it happen. However, nothing will ever compete with the experience of what happened when I started to hang out with a girl who had a very dark presence following her. Let's just call her C. C claimed to be psychic, amongst other things, and will also openly tell you that she has been followed by a shadow person since she was little. She also claimed that if I hung out with her long enough, I would definitely experience her shadow person. Man, was she right. The first night she stayed the night at my place, we were up late having a really heavy conversation about some shit that happened to her when she was younger. When I started to actually see a freaking orb shooting around the room. Yep. A self-illuminating light was darting from corner to corner. I interrupted her mid-thought to tell her that we weren't alone in the room. Without missing a beat, she says, "Oh yeah, that's the darkness that follows me." Just as she says this, I noticed a tall, shadowed silhouette of a man standing in the doorway behind her. All at once he got about a foot taller, then turned his frame to the side, walked several steps, then vanished into the darkest shadow in the corner of the room. I was ecstatic. I've to this point never actually seen an orb or shadow person in real life. This was intense. She then speaks loudly into the room. "We would like to try and communicate with you. You are free to use whatever energy you need to manifest in the room, but please do not take ours." I managed to fish my phone out of my pocket and try to turn on the video mode on my phone. The thing frozen up, and I had to restart it. While it was restarting, it died. C says not to worry about it. She then asks that we try and focus our energy by holding our hands above each other and to try and concentrate on the heat. We do this for about a minute. I can feel the space between our fingers getting warmer. When it went drastically colder almost immediately. You could move your hands to the side, and it would feel normal. But right where we focused was now ice cold. And that's when I smelled him. The closet thing I could describe it as was almost salty, sour, and musky. I'll never forget that smell. At this moment, I saw the strongest glowing orb just shoot between us. I am ecstatic with excitement. Then, I felt it. It touched my leg. I actually felt it touch me. The only way I could describe it would be as if a coldness had masked to it. The sensation caused my entire thigh to tingle. Then, I felt the most immediate and sudden shutdown. Like I had just taken a handful of sleeping pills, and they went off all at the same time. I was falling asleep very quickly. I tried to tell her I was going to lay down, but she saw it in my face and stood up and shouted, "Leave him alone. Stop taking his energy." I started to come back. It was amazing. I had no way to explain the sudden drop in my energy. After she asked him to stop, everything ceased. We didn't experience anything for the rest of the night. Cut 2. C was moving away to live with her mother in the south. We were having a very emotional goodbye. I was holding her in my arms outside of our cars in her driveway. When I heard what sounded like something being dragged behind my ear. In the air? When I felt 2 hands clamp down on my shoulders and violently pull me to the ground. It pulled me so hard I collapsed on the hood of her car. The same feeling of losing energy washed over me 100 times stronger than the moment in my house. I actually lost consciousness for a moment and had to boot back up. I was washed away. I could barely stand. I was empty. She knew right away. She started to cry and apologize. She told me that I wouldn't have to worry. As she was leaving, and I would never be touched by him again. We saw each other one more time before she left, but I never experienced anything quite like that again. There were some other things that happened during the time we were seeing each other. Another rather disturbing incident involved us driving one night in my car after picking up my then 3-year-old daughter. We smelled that same smell. We looked at each other and knew he was there. My daughter then started asking us who the man was. We tried to prod her. "What does the man look like?" He looks like a man." Pointing out her car window, "Why is the man crying?" "What else can you tell us about him?" "He's outside the car." "Why is he sad?" Then, all at once, the smell vanished, and she lost interest in the man. Even as we continued to question her about what she saw. I know this is a long story. And pretty unbelievable to say the least. So take it as you will. But I can attest that every one of these things happened. I've only experienced 3 paranormal instances so far in my life. Nothing terrifying but creepy nonetheless. Also, they were quite similar. The most recent one was when I was at my cousin's house for a party. I walked out of the kitchen and peeked into the kids' room, where all the children are. The door was ajar, and I could hear them laughing, and my brother was standing in the middle of the room. I'm about to turn and go into the living room when I see my brother walk out of the bathroom next to the kids' bedroom. I look into the living room and see all the adult males there, with the exception of my brother, who has just walked past me into the kitchen. I rush to the kids' room and open the door, and it's just the little ones playing. When I glanced into the room earlier, I had seen a tall, skinny male figure and assumed it was a brother. When I try to remember it now, all I see is black. Like just a shadow or silhouette. What's interesting is that my cousin's wife had 2 children from a previous relationship, and she claims that her ex's family practices black magic, they are Navajo, and that she thought her ex was astral projecting himself to their home. When they first moved in, my cousin's brother, who is sensitive to paranormal things, said he had seen a guy close to the apartment several times, by the stairs or the dumpster. My cousin can never recall the face, it's just a blur in his memories. I forget what it was about this figure that led my cousin's wife to believe it was her ex astral projection. This story is definitely going to be hard to believe, but it is 100% true. It's a story I've told very few people in real life because I know how crazy it sounds. I know people here have had weird experiences too, and a lot of you know more about folklore and entities than I do. Hopefully, some of you can help explain what I saw. I'd love to hear your theories. This occurred when I was 11 to 12, I'm 28 now, and I was staying the night at my friend Danny's house, who lived just a few houses down from mine. There was a large pond behind our neighborhood, and we spent a lot of time there growing up. We'd go fishing, ride bikes, explore the small forest, etc., but we really enjoyed catching turtles and tree frogs. Might sound weird, but what can I say? We had somewhat of an obsession with reptiles and amphibians. Another thing I should note is that there was an old Native American trail that went through all the backyards on our street. I wasn't the Trail of Tears, but it was related to it in some way, I don't really remember. Back to the story. I was up late playing video games with Danny, and after a while we wanted to do something else. It was close to midnight, but we decided to go out and try catching some tree frogs. A family that lived in a nearby house had gone on vacation, and they had a perfect backyard for catching frogs. We hopped their fence and started exploring. Almost immediately, I started getting a weird feeling. I had the feeling we were being watched or something was nearby, and there was this odd energy in the air. I don't know how to explain it, but something just felt off. I remember feeling afraid, but I had no reason to be. We had done this kind of thing many times before, and it never inspired fear. About 10 minutes in, we thought we heard the frog saying he helped me in a croaky, froggy voice over and over again. The weird thing is, we couldn't see any tree frogs with our flashlights, and the yard wasn't that big. They started chanting in unison, and that made it much louder. Feeling more than a little creeped out, we bolted out of there and back to the street. Now, we were standing under a streetlight on the street corner across from where the frog house was. I looked up at the light and noticed at least 15 dragonflies attached to each other, much like the human centipede. They were doing a spiraling motion as they flew closer and closer to the light. It was weird. So, we heard/saw 2 unusual things, but you could possibly explain them away. What happened next, however, made absolutely zero ducking sense. After the dragonflies did their thing and flew away, Danny and I remained standing under that streetlight. We began talking about the strangeness of the frogs in particular. We both heard them croaking the same phrase, and we were pretty much just saying what that was about. At some point during the conversation, I was instantly overcome with the most intense adrenaline rush I've had in my life. That feeling of fear without a source while at the frog house was back, but much stronger. It was like my fight or flight response was signaled for no reason. Once again, everything felt off, and it seemed like there was intense energy all around us, making the air heavy. I was terrified, and I found out later my buddy was feeling the same thing. I became as still as possible, listening intently to my surroundings. I didn't hear anything unusual, but I suddenly began to feel drawn to look at the street behind me. I knew something was there. Whatever was behind me was the source of my fear, and it was putting out overwhelming energy with its presence alone. I hesitantly turned around and looked. I have full body goosebumps just recalling this. In the middle of the street, about 20 yards away from us, there was an ordinary looking 5 to 7-year-old girl with long, dark black hair wearing a white nightgown. She was sitting Indian style on the street pavement with a doll in her lap, and she was combing the doll's hair with a hairbrush. I was pretty much terrified beyond imagination. I was frozen with fear and could barely think straight. There was an incredible amount of energy in the air, and I knew something wasn't natural. She looked innocent enough, but I felt like she could snap me in half with the snap of her fingers if she wanted to. Another creepy detail was that she never even looked at us. She kept her head down and focused on her doll, but she definitely knew we were there watching her. After what felt like an hour, realistically probably 15 to 30 seconds, a car turned onto the street and began heading down the hill towards the girl. I remember the headlights getting brighter and brighter as it approached her. You would think maybe I would try to save her real quick, but I legitimately couldn't move. Also, I didn't really expect her to get hit for some reason. I never felt like she was in any sort of danger. Eventually, she became lost in the car's headlights, never looking up from her doll this whole time, BTW, and the car just passed right through without any sound of a collision. It stopped at the stop sign 15 feet from us and made a right turn. We took our eyes off of where the girl was as we watched the car turn. When we looked back to where the girl had been, she was gone. Instead, there was a dog on the sidewalk precisely parallel to where the girl was sitting in the street. The dog was looking right at me when I noticed it, almost like it was waiting for me to see it. Then, it simply turned around and trotted up the hill in the other direction. After a few seconds, the shock wore off, and we sprinted back to Danny's house and spent half the night looking out his second-story window towards the street. I don't know what I saw, but Danny saw the exact same thing. I've always felt like there was a reason it happened for some reason, or a reason it showed itself, whatever it was, to us of all people. Last thing, the house in front of where the girl was seen was haunted. I lived on that street for 10 years, and 4 to 5 different families lived in the haunted house during those 10 years. All of them said it was haunted. This experience is one I never shared with anyone besides my brother. When I was about 13 years old, I was living in rural BC. One night I was in the hot tub on the deck outside just watching the woods, taking in the silence. It was winter time, and we just recently had a snowfall that left around knee-high of snow. It was around 2 to 3 a.m., and out of nowhere this very large wolf, bigger than one I have ever seen by far, came out of the woods. I remember its coat being a shimmering silver, and its bright, piercing green eyes. As this wolf was walking along the fence of our paddocks, it locked eyes with mine, and we just kind of stared at each other as he walked past me, both alone in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. What happened next till this day instantly makes my spine shiver. As the wolf walked past, he walked towards our barn with our horses in it. It became darker as it entered the barn, but the other side still had a bright light illuminating the outside that I could clearly see. This wolf, as it entered, halfway through, went from the shape of a wolf to a very large, broad-shouldered person. The horses didn't make a single sound, and this person that now stood roughly 7 feet tall rounded the corner towards the open field but didn't emerge from the other side, and I never saw it again. My brother had his own encounter with this same wolf. I'm guessing, he told me that he woke up randomly one night from the feeling of being watched. He then looked out his window to see a very large wolf walking away from his window, so I'm guessing it was watching him sleep. This place we lived at was old native ground. Our barn was an old schoolhouse where the Catholic priest would put the native children and teach them lessons on Christ. It even had the old desk and chairs inside still. My brother and I both saw children's faces in the panes of glass from that barn and lights turning on randomly. We had closet doors slam repeatedly for minutes at a time, footsteps, and feelings of being watched. In my room, I saw glowing red eyes on the ceiling, and I hid under my covers till morning. Anyway, my main subject of this and what I'm more seeking answers for is what I encountered outside in the middle of the night. After I looked around myself, the closest thing I could find was skinwalkers or wendigos, but from what I read, these creatures have deformed features or things that make them uncanny or straight up horrific. What I saw, nothing struck me as abnormal about this wolf besides its massive size, until it literally changed its entire form in front of me. And there's just so much that I experienced at this property that this just scratches the surface of everything. The wolf incident is just something I've never really been able to grasp and always wanted some kind of answer because it feels and sounds unbelievable. I also understand that the term skinwalker is Navajo lore and doesn't correlate with BC tribes, but this is just a representation of what I saw with the closest accuracy. I can't fall asleep right now and figured I'd share my one and only potentially paranormal encounter. It happened when I was 15, about 6 or 7 years ago, when I finally grew old enough to become a counselor at a summer camp I had attended annually for most of my childhood. The camp is Camo Inokajig in Plymouth, Wisconsin, if you want to check it out. You would imagine that a summer camp as large and old as Inokajig would have its fair share of scary stories and camp legends, but from my experience that really wasn't the case. Ghost stories around the campfire were, of course, popular, but there weren't really any specifically about the camp itself. That is, except one commonly accepted notion among the staff: Thunderbird Cabin 2 is haunted. See, the camp is separated into a boys' and girls' side, and these sides are further divided into sections, with names like Lakeview, Timber Trail, or, of course, Thunderbird. Counselors would rotate through sections throughout the summer. During the particular week of this story, I was stationed in Thunderbird and was assigned with another counselor, whom I'll call Keegan, to watch over the infamous Cabin 2. Stories about Cabin 2 varied. Entities outside of the windows, goatmen, scratching sounds at odd hours of the night, whatever. The diverse and often hyperbolized nature of these stories actually led me to doubt the legitimacy of all of them. It's a much more likely explanation that there was a desire for ghost stories at camp and that someone came up with Thunderbird 2 is haunted, lol, which just happened to stick. No. I still believe this, in fact. I do not believe in ghosts or the paranormal, but I know what I experienced, and any rational explanation I can come up with does not seem fully convincing. Anyway, it goes as follows. This week, I was assigned to watch the youngest group of boys, about 6 to 8. We like to have everyone in bed early since the young kids can be restless, and they needed time to wind down. This particular night, things went smoothly for Keegan and me. We had gotten all of the kids seemingly asleep rather quickly. Being a little older, we would stay up and chat or read, and this night was no different. We both sat in Keegan's bunk, sharing a pair of earbuds and watching YouTube videos. It's important now to describe the layout of a cabin in Thunderbird. They were simplistic, rectangular, raised wood cabins. The inner perimeter was lined with bunk beds and housed about 20 to 30 campers and 2 counselors. Small, high-set rectangular windows along all sides provide moderate moonlight at night. Anyways, we're watching a video, and all the kids are asleep. Dead quiet inside. You can barely hear the crackling of the dwindling campfire outside and the muffled normal sounds of a Midwest forest at night. That is, until something disturbs the peace. The unmistakable sound of someone shaking in a sleeping bag breaks the silence. It's clear from the noise and vibrations that one of the campers is basically flailing in their bunk. Their sleeping bag is rustling, the metal bunk is squeaking, and the sound of their bodies bouncing on the mattress makes a dull thumping. Keegan and I quickly take out the earbuds, pause for a moment to listen to the sound, and turn to each other with a concerned what the hell look on our faces. Initially, I'm actually worried a camper is having a seizure. And then, on the other side of the cabin, we hear the same noise. The same vibration. Only a few seconds after the first camper stared to shake, a second one joined in. Then another, and another, and another. Within 7 or 8 seconds, literally every ducking kid in this cabin is flailing in their bags. The sound of rustling fabric and straining bed springs is all you can hear. In the pale moonlight, you could also see the outlines of their bodies bouncing around a little. The entire cabin is vibrating at this point, and Keegan and I are frozen, wide-eyed, and terrified. We each have the same frightened look, and it's clear that neither of us have any idea what is going on or what to do. We sit, paralyzed, for some period of time while the collective possession around us continues. After 15 or 20 seconds of this, the cacophony stops. Like a switch is flipped, all of the campers stop moving and go perfectly still, back to sleeping undisturbed. Still immobilized with fear, Keegan and I still sit completely still as well, not talking or moving. Scared, I assume that this was simply the beginning of something worse. Unsure whether to run or check the campers. Minutes go by, both of us looking around, eyes darting to the door and the surrounding bunkers, both of us braced for impending doom. I'm not sure how, but at the same time both of us silently conclude we should bolt. As fast as we can, we leap from the bunk and sprint out the door into the clearing that accompanies the cabins. The only person still outside is our senior counselor, scrolling through his phone by the fire. He's surprised to see the 2 counselors of a cabin dash out the way we did. Panicked, we try to explain what the hell happened. He brushes it off but agrees to check the cabin. As you can guess, he doesn't see or hear anything but peacefully sleeping campers. We, reluctantly, return to the cabin and get in our beds. Still on high alert, I lay awake for some time, braced and waiting for something. But, alas, I drift off at some point. Wouldn't you believe it? In the morning, none of the kids claimed to know anything about the night previous. They all claimed to have fallen asleep like any other night, and the phenomenon does not continue any following night. As someone who is wholly skeptical and, as previously stated, does not believe in anything not well founded or observed scientifically, I struggle to think what might have caused this. I want to think it was a prank, but I just don't think that a bunch of young children could coordinate something like this so well, or even more so, retain their innocence in the matter. If anyone has any similar stories or even heard anything that could cause this, I'm all ears. It will probably be the most confused and scared I'll ever be in my life. The situation was just so bizarre and sudden. I hope I properly conveyed just how creepy it was. Sometimes I think it's a dream, but I don't know if my mind could conjure what I saw. I used to stay in a basement apartment with my then boyfriend. There was a small window under the porch, so we could still see outside, even if it was mostly sprouting plants and a bit of the neighbor's fence. One night, I awoke to scratching on the window. I knew the cats were inside, and we didn't have any other pets. I kept my eyes closed and rolled over, ignoring it. It continued, and I assumed it was only a neighborhood dog or something of the sort, that is, until it started tapping at the glass. My eyes shot open, and I sat up in bed. What I saw is something I will never forget. A gnarled black figure was crouching under the porch, and even in the dim glow of the streetlight, I could see the rotting, dingy teeth lining its twisted grin. It extended one arm that looked almost human, but it was a dreadful facsimile. It looked as if the arm had been broken many times and was never reset properly, as it looked crooked. I couldn't look away. I felt a lump in my throat. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound escaped. However, the creature's hand pointed, but not at me. I looked to what it was pointing to. My boyfriend was sound asleep behind me. They didn't want me. I looked back, and it was gone. Over the next few months, he changed drastically. He became abusive and violent, we were constantly fighting, and I had to end it and move out. As much as I told myself it was just a hellish nightmare, the abuse I suffered could only tell me one thing. The demon got what it wanted. Him. Back in the summer of 2010, I was a 16-year-old female living in Oklahoma. The house we had recently renovated belonged to my grandmother, who had just passed away 1 year prior and owned the house we recently renovated. My family was not well off, we weren't even considered middle class. We had to move into my grandmother's abandoned home because we had no place to go. The house had only one bedroom, one bathroom, and a living room that was combined with the kitchen. We had 5 people in our family, my parents and us 3 children. So my parents decided they would take the bedroom and that we would sleep on the 2 couches in the living room. Now, I had experienced many odd things in this house throughout the years. However, I'll be focusing on one memory that will always give me goosebumps. One summer night, after a day of riding our bikes around town, my friend Mary Beth and I decided that we would have a sleepover at my house. My house was quaint yet dull, but we had a good time of our own, just enjoying each other's company and, of course, the occasional gossip. As we lay on the couches trying to drift to sleep, a shadow suddenly appeared in the kitchen. Tall, dark, and ominous. At that time, nobody was home except Mary Beth and me. Being skeptical as to what I was seeing, I continued to stare at what seemed to be a dark figure. Searching the room for an answer as to what could cast a shadow, I soon realized there was no answer. Filled with fear and a trembling heart, I dove under the blanket. As if it were some sort of shield that would protect me, I hung on tight, clinging it to my person. What the hell was that? I thought. That's why I remembered I had a cell phone. Did you see that? I wrote to Mary Beth. She replied, confirming she had seen the same thing. Realizing there was nothing we could do, we laid under the blankets, hoping either to fall asleep or that someone would come home. 15 minutes later, I messaged Mary Beth, asking if she was awake. No reply was an answer itself. That's when a familiar, faint voice said, "Haley, what are you doing?" The voice had come from the floor by my feet. "Haley, what are you doing?" The question was repeated, but that's when I realized that was my mother's voice, or so it seemed. I checked my phone to see the time. It wasn't time for her to be home. If she were home, I would have heard her car drive up and enter the house. The front door is heavy wood and loud to open/shut. My mother never came home. My mother would not be talking on the floor. "What are you doing?" The voice repeated louder and closer. At this point, I was completely aghast. Petrified and confused, I began to bawl. Sobbing so hard I couldn't hear or see. That night I cried myself to sleep. Looking back, I'm not sure how many friends didn't hear me. On some level I believe she heard everything, and on another I want to believe she didn't. That was neither the first nor the last event to occur in that house. I do believe all of the negative energy my family had probably fed into whatever was happening. When we moved out of that house, I finally felt at peace. I lived in West Germany for 8 years as a child. My father was in the US military and was stationed there twice, once from when I was 2 to 6 years old and again when I was 8 to 12 years old. This was just before reunification in 1990. Our family, my parents, my younger sister, and me, went all over the country exploring, visiting parks and castles. We enjoyed hiking through the woods and taking boat rides down the Rhine. The event I'm writing about happened when I was 8 and my sister was 3. We went on a hiking trail through the Black Forest. This was not a long 2 to 4 day trail, rather, it was a 1-day loop trail. The trail had rest stops, really just a flat place with a few benches and tables, every 5 kilometers or so. We had stopped for a rest, My parents were sitting and talking with a Canadian family, my sister was in her stroller, and I was playing in the dirt just off the path. More than anything else, I remember how peaceful everything was. The sound of the breeze through the trees. The way the light filtered down through the canopy. I cannot describe the immeasurable peace I felt. The absolute stillness of the woods was almost a physical presence. For some reason I was so overcome with it I decided to walk into the woods. I don't know how far I walked, but I was lost almost immediately. I could sort of hear the sound of people talking from the rest stop, but I had no idea which direction it was coming from, filtered through the trees. The odd thing though is I wasn't afraid at all. I still felt that immeasurable peace. I don't know how long I walked, but it felt like hours. Then I saw her. I say her because even without identifying sexual characteristics, the presence was overwhelmingly feminine. She was a person, but not. Her skin was like skin, but also like bark. Like twisted twigs and branches woven together. Her hair was moss green, fuzzy, and short. No mouth, no nose. Her eyes were huge and oval. She had a yellowish-orange iris and a tiny black pupil. They took up most of the face. There was no malice in them, just awareness and sadness. She held out her branch hand to me, and I took it without hesitating. It felt like wood, but alive, like a living branch but also flesh. She led me back to the trail, about 20 meters away from the rest stop. I say led, but that's not really it. We moved through the forest without moving. I still can't wrap my head around it years later. She released my hand, placed her finger on her face in a shh gesture, and then vanished. My parents were just packing up my sister. I thought I was gone for hours, but it was more like 20 to 30 minutes. They had thought I walked up the trail a bit and then came back. Now, here's where I need help. I need an artist, someone who can draw, do police sketches, or anything like that, to help me make a recreation of what I saw. I have no artistic talent whatsoever, and I need to see what I saw again, but outside my memory, I need to give it physical form. I dream about what happened occasionally, and it leaves a haunting longing in my heart that I don't understand. My girlfriend and I moved into a new apartment roughly 3 years ago. She has since then been suffering from weekly sleep paralysis. Her brother used to have them when they were children, so she knew what it was right away. She has described it as being completely paralyzed besides breathing and moving her eyes, and most of the time she sees a dark, tall figure moving around our apartment when they happen. Sometimes she just hears him walking, sometimes he's staring at her from the door, and sometimes he presses down on her chest, making it difficult for her to breathe. She is a non-believer in the paranormal, yet these sleep paralysis terrify her. Now to the really scary part. She usually manages to wake me up during these by breathing quickly and loudly. I can then wake her from it, which allows her to move again and the figure disappears. What I haven't told her is that these past 2 months I've seen the figure as well. Right after I'm woken up by her breathing, I can see it bent over her, pushing down on her ribcage. It always disappears the second I acknowledge it or try to wake her. I've also seen it standing in the hallway staring at me one night while I was home alone watching a movie. I pretended I didn't see it, and it had disappeared the next time I looked over. Now to the dilemma. Do I tell my girlfriend that her sleep paralysis demon might not be a regular sleep paralysis demon, since I've seen it too, and at the same time as her, waking her up from the paralysis at night? I don't want to scare her. She is already terrified from the sleep paralysis, and that is when she feels certain that it's just in her own head. We can't afford to move. I think we both can live like this, given I never tell her the truth. When I was 14, I had a strange encounter that still puzzles me to this day. On the weekends, I'd sometimes go to my mother's place. My parents are divorced. The house she lived in was converted into several small apartments. It was a creepy old farmhouse. The house was at least 150 years old. My mom told me off and on of strange sounds she'd been hearing and seeing things in the corner of her eyes, feeling of being watched. This one particular evening when I spent the night, I brought my N64 because my mom would go to bed early and I'd still be up for a few more hours. I still remember to this day what game I was playing, WWF No Mercy. I was sitting Indian style on the floor, playing the story mode. I just finished a mission in the game and set down the controller to the left, behind me. Directly behind me was a recliner. I'll never forget what I saw next. I went to grab the controller and saw what appeared to be a hoof, like a horse next to the controller on the floor. Insects and blood came out of the sliver that separated the hoof. I slowly glanced up, and this demonic figure was staring back at me. It leaned down towards me, its face got down in my face, and it grinned the most evil smile. The eyes were black, full of hatred and rage, the face was red, one-winged creature. Blood was dripping from the tips of its jagged, sharp teeth. It was so surreal I immediately went into a panic attack and blacked out. I learned later it was the fight or flight response. Several seconds later I came to, laying on the floor, and could barely move. The demonic figure in the chair laughed at me. It was as if my fear and energy had been sucked dry from me. I lost all strength. It was frightening. I can't put it into words just how bad it was. I did all I could to crawl away from it while clenching my chest, my body shaking uncontrollably from the fear and panic, and when I looked over my shoulder, I saw it laughing at me. My mother's room was a mere 15 feet away from the TV, yet it seemed like forever crawling there. I did all I could to crawl to my mom's room and wake her up. I couldn't speak or stand up for quite some time after witnessing what I had just gone through. After I woke her up, we talked, and she believed me. She told me that she and her boyfriend had seen the same thing weeks earlier but didn't want to scare me. I don't know what to make of it and still think of it to this day. I have no doubt that demons and angels are real, and believe me, the last thing you ever want to encounter is a demon smiling in your face. I don't care if you believe me or not, but when 3 people see the same thing on 2 separate occasions, at 2 separate locations, either we're all crazy or something was wrong with that old farmhouse. My mom told me prior to her moving into her apartment that she and her boyfriend had seen the same thing while they were living at my grandfather's house. My mom has thankfully moved on, and we haven't encountered that thing again. To my knowledge, everything I explain here is true. Much of this relies on the word of my father, so take everything with a grain of salt, but judging by his reactions and lack of composure, I believe him entirely. Anyway, enough with the introduction. I have only been told this story twice. The first time was when I was 6 or 7, and I was too young to listen/become invested. The second time I was told I was about 12, and I knew that I would likely never hear it again. I took painstaking steps to transcribe it word for word. I have asked my father relentlessly for years to hear the story again, to no avail. He seems to avoid the topic entirely, as if he is slightly traumatized/freaked out by it. I have been able to talk with another person that was present at the event, his name being Rose. Both stories, from my father and Rose, match up pretty well, albeit the minor details that both parties remember differently. For the sake of the story, we will use my father's first name, Carter. In 1986, Carter was about 17 years old. In this time he lived with his mother in Plattsburgh, New York. Plattsburgh was a small college town, and thus my father spent most of his time with a small group of friends. During their high school summers, they would all go driving/hiking to the dense woods of upstate New York, getting closer and closer to the Canadian border. In total, there were 6 of them, and they all brought various kinds of alcohol and would camp on isolated lakesides for days at a time. One guy in particular, named Rose, became increasingly interested in this one unnamed lake that was practically in the middle of nowhere forest. It would take days to get there, with most of the time being spent hiking. So for their junior-senior summer, they all decided to humor Rose and go to this new lake. Whether this lake was actually unnamed might be a stretch. There are a multitude of lakes in upstate New York, and I'm pretty sure most, if not all, are named. I've tried asking about/finding the lake, but investigation isn't my strong suit. They claim not to remember the name, insisting it was unnamed. There's 3 girls and 3 guys, including Rose and Carter, stacking up all the liquor and camping equipment they could get their hands on, headed off to the new lake. The first day of travel, mostly driving, was largely uneventful, according to Carter and Rose. The second day was spent hiking. Sometimes on a trail, sometimes not on a trail. At this point, they are far from any town or city, and the closest thing to civilization they can get are old logging roads or service roads. At some point, they even traveled off of those. It was close to sunset on the first day of hiking. As they were walking single file through the woods, a girl in the middle of the line began freaking out. Screaming, pointing, tearing up. They were on a slight incline, and she pointed down the hill at something no one had noticed. She was freaking out about the shredded carcass of a deer. Rose recounted to me specifically that the deer was not eaten nor shot. It was simply shredded, as if something had hunted it, then refused to eat it. Rose and Carter decided to go investigate. Upon descending down the hill, they saw something inexplicable. The corpse of the deer was on the edge of a circular clearing. In the center of the clearing was a black monolith. I asked for a better description, and I got something akin to obsidian-like rock statue. It wasn't massive by any means, just oddly placed squarely in the center of the clearing. What freaked Carter and Rose out entirely, however, was the shredded animal carcasses lining the entire clearing. Carter explains to me that he felt as if the animals tried to walk into the clearing and dropped dead on the spot. Rose imagined something dragging the dead animals to the edge of the clearing. The two freaked out, walked back to the group, and explained what they saw. For whatever reason, something they still can't justify to this day, they continued onward to the lake. "We really wanted to see the lake," said Rose. Eventually, they actually reached the lake the next day. It was decently sized and oval-shaped. Entirely isolated, no one could be seen on the shores. It was, by both accounts, a lovely lake. They set up a campfire by the lakeside, and by nightfall, they had begun drinking and eating. Rose and Carter sat opposite each other. Rose had his back to the lake and could see the tree line, while Carter had his back to the trees and could see the lake. It was around 1 a.m., and the fire had died down a little bit. They were telling scary stories, messing with each other, when Rose suddenly got an alarming look on his face. Rose was looking behind Carter at the forest line. Rose insisted Carter turn around. Trying not to be taken for a fool, Carter knew Rose was just messing with him and told him to duck off. It wasn't until Rose and others stood up to investigate that Carter turned around. Out of the woods walks a little kid. A little child. Carter says he couldn't have been older than 7. He was wearing a gray hoodie and blue jeans. His hood was up, and he was some distance away, so no one could really see the boy's face. He stopped, just outside of the firelight. Some of the girls of the group immediately went up to him to see if this boy was alright. No one knew, he could have been hurt or lost. They began asking him questions, and the conversation went something like this. "Are you okay?" "No." "What's wrong? Are you lost?" "I need help." "What's your name?" "Little Steven, can you help me?" And so on. Evidently, the group was freaked out. The kid kept asking for vague help, constantly gesturing back into the woods, but some feeling stopped them from following. One of the girls gently pushed him closer to the fire and pulled back his hood. She jumped back. The kid had entirely black, enlarged eyes. I asked Rose if it could have been a trick of the light, as it was nighttime and the only source of light was a campfire. It was something everyone noticed, and it made everyone step back. It was unnatural, he recounts. At this point the child began asking for help over and over and over and over again, to which a girl muttered, "No, we can't help you." With that, the boy walked back into the woods, no one else in sight. Freaked out by both events, they all abandoned the trip and quickly ditched the lake. This is where things get even more interesting. Fast forward to recently. Once again, I'm begging my father to tell me the story of little Steven, or some other story for that matter. Does anyone have Xfinity cable with that remote that has a microphone in it? You know, you can say, "Show me The Office," and it pulls up The Office on TV. Well, I was being a little shit and messing around with my dad because I'm young, I don't know. I grabbed the remote and said, "Show me, little Steven." No results. Show me a black-eyed child. Then something appears. It's a movie. The icon shows a little girl with black eyes in the woods wearing a gray sweatshirt and jeans. My jaw drops. For years, this had always been in the realm of fantasy for me. Now, it was almost tangible. My father goes upstairs, and I don't see him for the rest of the day. I spend my whole time researching this black-eyed children phenomenon. You guys, it's supposedly something people encounter. Look it up, it's crazy. I don't entirely understand it, but the Google search result explains it the best. Black-eyed children are a contemporary legend of supposed paranormal creatures that resemble children between the ages of 6 and 16, with pale skin and black eyes, who are reportedly seen hitchhiking or panhandling, or are encountered on doorsteps of residential homes. I've also read something that claims they try to lure people away, and if anyone follows, they go missing. There are supposedly still sightings that occur to this day. Does anyone have any input, any possible answers, or questions? I'm just looking for something. This has kind of rocked my world as of recent. My parents live in a farmhouse that's over 100 years old. During the Depression, it was used as a sort of orphanage for boys. Boys would come to work and be provided food or lodging. My dad doesn't allow us to talk about the stuff that goes on in the house. Story 1. My husband, then boyfriend, and I returned home for the weekend. We slept on an air mattress in the upstairs corridor. Around 2 a.m., I woke up. I could feel my husband's body stiffen. He wasn't moving. I looked towards the wall and saw a green fog moving, almost like a hand. It went above us. I could see us both sweating, afraid to move. A few minutes passed. I reached up and flicked on the light. Neither of us said anything and went back to sleep. About a week later, we were back on campus, getting pizza. While waiting for our order, he casually brought up that night. I saw the weirdest thing, like a green haze, almost like a hand. I had seen it, too. Story 2. When we first moved into our house, I was maybe 4. My parents had invited over their college friends. My mom and aunt both claim they watched a pie levitate off the counter, over the floor, and drop. Story 3. Most of the stuff that happens seems to happen in my brother's room. When I was in my teens, I fell asleep on his bed mid-afternoon. I woke up to see shadowy people walking across the room. The people appeared to be teenage boys. At this point I wasn't aware of the house's history. Story 4. My brother has witnessed things levitating in his room. Last night I got a call from a military buddy that he was looking for a ride home from the bar and didn't want to spend $30 on an Uber ride. I said sure. I was hungover myself and figured it would help to drive with the windows down and get some air. It was probably 12:30 a.m., and I was driving around my neighborhood trying to take an alternate route that I hadn't taken before but knew about, basically one that went through residential areas and stayed off of the bigger, more populated routes. I didn't really want to fight traffic the entire way getting downtown. So as I'm driving, everything is normal. I was listening to some random podcast about World War II, but then as I'm passing this one random house a couple streets down from mine, there's a kid standing in the front yard, right on the edge of the road. TBH, this doesn't sound that weird, but looking back, it was past midnight, and this kid was maybe 10 to 11 years old. He had on a red shirt, tan shorts, and sneakers with a blonde bowl cut, a totally normal looking kid. So as I'm coming up to this kid, I get to a speed bump and have to slow down, so I was able to get a better look at him. He wasn't playing, he wasn't running around, no other kids were with him, he was just standing completely still and meeting my gaze as I'm going past. Like the entire way down the street, he doesn't stop staring. And after I had passed him, I kept looking at my rear view mirror, and he still doesn't stop looking. He doesn't cross the street or go back to playing around, he just keeps standing there staring at my truck. On the drive back, I told my friend after picking him up about the kid, and he was interested, so I took him back through the same way where I saw the kid, but this time he wasn't there. Fast forward to when me and my friend get back to my place sitting in my living room shooting the shit watching YouTube, and we hear this super fast, quiet knocking at the door, like so quiet my AC almost completely smothered the sound. It's like 1:30 a.m. at this point, and both my roommates are out of town for the long weekend, so I was kind of weary of answering the door. I peek out the window next to the front door and see no one there. Honestly, this could have just been a tree limb hitting the roof near the front door, but in that moment it was like I was having a heart attack thinking I'd see that kid there. Later, when I was in bed just laying there, I heard a few more random knocks in different places. My bedroom is right next to the front door and goes out onto the patio that the front door connects to. These knocks could have been at the front door or just in some random spot in the house. At this point, I was so tired I really didn't care to worry about it and passed out. Waking up this morning thinking about it, those knocks creeped me out a bit more, but just doing a walkthrough of my front patio, nothing was out of the ordinary, so there's not much else to go on. I know this really isn't the most bone-chilling story, but it kind of goes to show how kids can be so creepy with no effort. The following happened in a nearby woods when I was in 7th or 8th grade, late 1980s, and to this day I have no idea what it was or why it happened. I'll preface this story by saying that, although I was fairly young when it took place, I had literally grown up in the middle of a forest and spent just about every free moment out among the trees. I never had any fear of nature, and by the time I was in middle school, I was already a pretty competent hunter and tracker and could identify just about any animal by its tracks, sounds, and/or scat. I'd had close-up encounters with groundhogs, raccoons, deer, and even coyotes and great horned owls. Which is why whatever my friend and I encountered that day confuses me. I was at my friend R's, also a burgeoning outdoorsman, house one afternoon, and we decided to walk to a small woods maybe a quarter mile from his house just to check it out. I think it must have been late fall or early spring because the trees were bare, the ground was muddy, and it was chilly outside, around 40-50 F. We weren't looking for anything, it was just something to do. So we walk over, enter the woods, and just start walking around, talking, and looking at the trees and the occasional bits of trash people had left behind. Eventually, we wander apart from each other by maybe 30 yards. There's not much overgrowth, so we can still see each other. It was about this time that I started getting that being watched feeling. A second later, out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of a white flash 4 to 5 feet off the ground. It seemed to come from or dodge behind one of the trees. It wasn't light, exactly, but more like a very white object of undefinable shape and size. I looked around for a minute but never saw anything else and figured it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. So I went back to exploring. But then it happened again. And still, I couldn't see anything when I looked around more directly. After a few seconds, the flash or white object seems to appear and disappear among the trees in different directions. One time it would be off to my left, and then a few seconds later it would be to my right or just behind me. I was a little freaked out, but mostly just really curious as to what was happening. This went on for maybe 3 or 4 minutes. Right about then, I noticed that he was standing next to me, looking pale and shaken up. "I think we should go back now," he said. I have to admit, I was a little disappointed. But I had never seen him look or act quite that way before. Usually, the kid wasn't afraid of anything and was a little bit of a troublemaker. So we trudged out of the woods and back onto the little gravel road that ran to it and headed back toward his house. I didn't say anything the whole way back. When we finally got back to his house, we went to get a snack, and as we were standing in the kitchen, I just briefly asked him, "So, out there, did you see some kind of white thing?" Because I kept. Almost immediately, he cut me off. "Yeah. I don't want to talk about it." Again, it was a response that was very out of character for my normally tough-talking friend. A couple years later, I, and another friend would be on a late-night walk, get mistaken for burglars, and have a gun pulled on us. Even after being threatened with a firearm, he was never this quiet or freaked out, so I dropped it. And in decades of rambling around every sort of wood that I can find, I've never encountered anything like that again. My wife and I were with a small group in Brazil doing some benevolent work, spending a week doing repairs, painting, and construction. We've done this quite a few times. It's something we enjoy, and we know the people there well. We were assigned a living unit to refurbish, one with 8 boys living in it. This is usually one of my favorite parts of visiting, getting to know the boys who live there. What an amazing and loving group of people Brazilian kids are, even in a tough situation like an orphanage. However, this time, there was one younger boy about 9 years old who wouldn't speak to us. He would just sit and stare angrily and would ignore all attempts at communication or friendship. One of the other boys pulled us aside the second day and told us to avoid him, that he was wrong and that it was best to ignore him and stay away. This was shared in Portuguese, and our knowledge of the language is basic, so we weren't sure what he was saying exactly. But sadly, by the third day we decided our friend was right and stopped trying to reach out to him. This boy seemed to exhibit anger and malevolence. We worked the week and finished up and said some sad goodbyes to the other boys. The last night we traditionally have dinner with the orphanage's director in his house on the campus. We ate and stayed late for wine and conversation, as is the tradition. However, I started feeling really ill. Being in the backwoods of Brazil, it's pretty easy to catch something or eat something that doesn't sit well. The house was hot, I was feeling pretty rough, and I decided to step outside for some fresh air. I went out the side door and onto the path that led down the hill back to the residence units. I was thinking I might actually throw up. I didn't want the other guests to hear me gagging, so I walked a ways down the path and then stepped off it, in case I did actually lose my dinner. I stepped into a small side path that led to a small outdoor shrine to Mary that I knew was there. Most of the people who run the orphanage are Catholic. I looked up to see if there was a place I could sit, and that's when I saw him. Hours after curfew, there in the dark, was the boy. He didn't look at me. In fact, he was standing in front of the small icon of the shrine and facing the director's house. Something didn't look right, and when I took a step closer, I realized he appeared to be convulsing. His body was jittering, with occasional violent shakes. It looked exactly like an epileptic seizure, except he was upright, not laying on the ground. Thinking he was in trouble, in some sort of medical emergency, I took a few more steps into the clearing, and that's when I saw it. I don't know if I was sick or too tipsy from the wine or what, but there in the dark it looked like the boy's feet weren't touching the ground. I was stunned, confused, and stopped in shock to stare, too startled to move closer. I looked harder, and it looked exactly like the boy's feet were dangling and jittering about a foot off the ground. I panicked. I started backing out, they turned to run, but I began throwing up violently. Ever tried to run and vomit at the same time? It doesn't work. I went back to the house, entered and took a side hall to the guest bathroom, and did my laundry to clean up and compose myself. What to do? I joined the party, and everyone immediately commented that I didn't look well. I admitted to being sick, and we took our leave. We made it back to the guest house, and as my wife tried to help me, I told her what had happened. She was as stunned as I was. Yet we both had no idea what to do. In the end, I decided to talk to the director the next day, before we left. Neither of us slept well. The next day, as the small team was getting without things at the van that would take us back to the airport, I pulled the director aside. Without specifics, I shared with him that I had had some strange interactions with the young boy living in 3C. Before I could get any further, his expression grew dark, and he nodded. Apparently, he was aware of the strange behavior and antisocial nature of the boy and asked what had happened. I didn't feel like I could share my experience. I didn't want him to think I was crazy, but we shared about the anger, the staring, and the non-communication. Apparently, it was all anybody experienced with him. He told me the boy had been brought to them from the favelas of Bahia, a state in Brazil somewhat known for its version of voodoo, or Santeria called candomblé. He was pretty sure the boy had been mixed up in it or some other form of spiritism before being picked up by the police as a street kid. He said many of the other boys had expressed fear or misgivings about him and had warned the director that he should be sent away. I asked the director what he planned to do. This guy is an amazingly kind man. He's given his and his family's lives to helping as many of the Brazilian street orphans as he could. He is a man of strong faith, and he said he was loath to send him away, as it would mean defeat and could be a death sentence for the boy. I didn't know what to say. We eventually said goodbye. This happened last spring, their fall, and I haven't written or called to find out whatever happened. Part of me is too scared to ask, and I'm trying to get it out of my mind, honestly. But after a life of working in places like that with people from all walks of life, that was the scariest and spookiest thing I have ever experienced, for sure. 2 nights ago, I was admitted to the hospital after getting a UTI infection, which led to me having sepsis. I'm still in the hospital, but last night I had the scariest/weirdest experience. My bed on the ward is by a window that overlooks the different parts of the hospital. You can basically just see a bunch of windows if you look out the window where my bed is. If you look out the window, the first thing you notice is the corridors because they're always lit up. I was in bed waiting to fall asleep when I noticed a woman standing in the corridor. Obviously, it could have just been a doctor or nurse on the night shift. I kept looking and realized that it couldn't be because the person didn't have their uniform on. It definitely wasn't a person visiting because the visiting hours are until 7 p.m., and it was around 11 p.m. at night when this happened. They turned around, and it looked like they noticed me. Before, they were standing with their backs towards the windows. Then they took probably 2 steps forward, and then they were gone. These corridors are long, and the walls are all glass, so it's not like they could have knelt behind a wall. Saying that, they didn't even kneel or duck, they just walked and vanished. The most terrifying thing was the direction it went, the way to where my ward is. I've had a ton of paranormal experiences, but nothing scary, really. The paranormal doesn't freak me out anyway, and I don't believe in demons personally, so nothing has ever really terrified me. I guess the creepiest thing that's happened to me, though, was when I was a child. My grandparents used to live in this big, beautiful, very haunted Victorian house. As a child, I stayed there most days while my parents worked. They had a screened-in porch, so when the weather was nice, my younger brother and I would play out there. My grandparents would leave the front door open, the front door led to the porch, and there was another door to get outside, and you could see onto the porch in the house, so we weren't unattended. One day, during the summer, my brother and I were playing on the porch when we heard the front door start to creak. We both look up and over, expecting to see one of our grandparents, but the door swings shut, and we hear the deadbolt turn, locking us out. I get up to see if we're locked in, and we are. I think I must have been around 7 or 8 at the time, so this really freaked me out. I didn't know how to get back into the house, and I didn't want to be left on the porch, so I started pounding on the door, yelling to my grandfather. I can see him race out from his den, and he unlocks the door and opens it up, asking how I shut and locked it. I told him I didn't, and that my brother and I saw it happen. My grandfather said he didn't do it, either, and my grandmother was upstairs, in the shower. Paranormally, it didn't freak me out, because that stuff happened all the time in the house, but I didn't want to be locked out of the house, so that scared me. I loved that house though. The craziest stuff happened there. If you slept over, it was almost guaranteed that you'd be woken up every night by pots literally banging together downstairs in the kitchen, and if you went to investigate, the sound would stop. The old house phones we used to have, the ones with the cords, would be stretched throughout different rooms and just left on the floor. My grandparents also had a skeleton key that would go missing all the time, only to be found in places like the washing machine, which turned on by itself once with only the key inside, which is how we found it. My favorite paranormal story from that house though was one my grandmother told me. She was never scared of ghosts either. The hallway on the 2nd floor was very long, and they had a nightlight there, so you could see your way to the bathroom. One night, her bedroom door opened, and she was woken up because the light from the nightlight was shining in. She got up and closed the door, then went back to bed. Not even 10 minutes later, the door opened again. She thought she hadn't shut it well, so she got up, closed it again, and got back into bed. A third time, it swung open, so with a huff, she stomped over, shut it, and got back into bed. When the door opened for a 4th time, she yelled, "God damn it, knock it off." And the door slammed shut and stayed that way. The ghosts in that house were never scary. They were almost kind of playful. Annoying, but playful at times. I'm a chaplain for the Order of St. John and a demonologist. I spend much of my time doing community visits in households where people believe they're dealing with paranormal activity. My job is to go and investigate it, apply interventions or escalate, and then stay in touch for a couple of months to monitor things. Interventions are blessings, typically, or what we call minor rites of exorcism, and escalation is when I get my archbishop involved. I work directly for him. Anyway, story. If you don't already believe in paranormal stuff, this story won't be for you. Also, I want to make clear that if a client says they saw something, I believe them, but I don't necessarily consider evidence unless I see it. Psychology and the paranormal can get complicated quickly. The woman on the stairs. For this job, I was called out to a house via Facebook groups, and someone posted into local area groups asking for help. He had reached his last straw with some things he believed were going on, and I could tell he wasn't in a good space, so I reached out and got involved. When I went to visit him, the house seemed relatively normal and modern. Sorry, not like the movies, but there was definitely an uneasy feeling. There were a couple of things I wanted to look at, but one of the key problems was the actual client. The client had been dealing with stuff for so long he had become intensely anxious. Every little thing set him off the rails, and he had a 1-year-old son in the house as well. We really needed to calm him down first before addressing anything, so I did some work with him regarding his anxiety and how to control it. The paranormal activity he said happened was things like drawers opening and closing, things apparently flying off shelves at the client, eyes looking through light fixtures in the ceiling, the sound of someone rummaging in the garage, which connected by a door to the living room, sleep paralysis, and a woman screaming. Also, his son would point at random spots in the house and say, "Ghost, ghost." A lot of these sounded like possible mental health symptoms, so I made sure to get him assessed. My background is in psychology. The assessments showed incredibly heightened anxiety, but nothing else. When I was investigating the house, some strange things did happen. I didn't really like the Ghost Tube app. I was incredibly skeptical of it, but sometimes if I'm drawing blanks, I'll give it a go. Because of this, I now take it more seriously. I went into the garage, and I did get a feeling of dread, but I'm mindful of my own psychology and fear response. In the garage was the car of one of the homeowner's friends who had passed away in a car accident, in a different vehicle. Just before this, they had fought and said some unkind things to each other. Nothing happened while I was in there, so I pulled out my phone and jumped on Ghost Tube. At first there was nothing, so I placed my phone down on top of the car. After a minute or two, the app kept repeating the name Linda. 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 If you have this app, you'll know this is strange. Usually it will say a word, then different words, then maybe repeat itself. I went and grabbed my phone, turned on all the infrared gadgets, and saw nothing. I went out into the living room to ask if the client knew a Linda, and as I walked through the door, I saw a funeral program for someone called Linda. In my profession, this is like striking gold. I figured I'd worked out the who but just needed to work out the why. I blessed the garage to move Linda on and considered the job done. As I blessed and opened the doors, his son waved and said, "Bye, ghost." However, the client reached out shyly a couple of weeks later. He told me things hadn't calmed down at all, except for in the garage. I considered myself an idiot and went back. This time, while investigating, I decided to go straight back to Ghost Tube. I went in the garage, and there was nothing. No feelings of dread, no Ghost Tube hits. Activity in that area had gone. But there was definitely a stuffy discomfort in several places in the house, and the bedroom of the client was freezing cold. Even though it's a second-level room that sees sunlight all day, it's summer where I am. The rest of the house Ghost Tube kept repeating the same two things, which is again, unusual. Every minute or so it would say, "You're funny," or "There's 5 of us." I did a comprehensive investigation and decided to bless the whole house, which included the small attic space where the client saw eyes. I put on my order stole and got to work. While blessing, 2 strange things happened. Firstly, a wall cross I had given the client jumped off of its hook, which isn't altogether indicative of something but made me weary. And the second thing was, after blessing the attic, I came out of the bedroom and turned toward the stairs leading downstairs to the living room. This is by far some of the most overt activity I've ever seen. These stairs have 2 levels and change direction in the middle. The client has a mirror on the stairs that allows him to see upstairs and downstairs. As I came down the stairs, in the mirror, I could clearly see a very tall woman in a floral blue dress, with long black hair and a ponytail running down her back, standing and facing away from the stairs toward the living room where the client was. I thought this was a visitor that had arrived while I was blessing, so I prepared myself to say, "Excuse me, sorry." When I turned the stairs, she was not there. I checked the mirror again, and she was no longer there, which is a damn relief considering I was standing where she was. I don't talk to my clients about evidence because I don't want to scare them, and usually I try to subtly confirm evidence without them outright knowing. So I asked him about each area of the house, which is standard protocol. I asked about the attic, the bedrooms, the kitchen, the living room, outside, bathrooms, and lastly the stairs. When I got to the stairs, he said, "There's a woman on the stairs. Sometimes you can hear her walking up and down them. She's really tall with dark hair." He said that she sometimes stands at the top of the stairs looking into his bedroom, but he only ever sees her out of the corner of his eye. I immediately blessed the staircase with frankincense, myrrh, and holy water. I did a fairly lengthy and intensive prayer for this one and felt a lift of pressure from my chest near the end. In my profession, we usually need to know why things are happening to actually resolve them. All I could really hone in on was that, sometimes, the homeowner's cousin spent weekends visiting. She was younger, early teens, and stayed with him to have a break from her family, and she was into things like Ouija, tarot, and exploring abandoned buildings. I can't be sure this was the cause and want to be clear that I don't think these things necessarily invite, but rather I think she did a dumb thing and used them to invite something/s into the home. I would have liked to have gotten my hands on the tarot and Ouija, but this would be slightly overstepping, I think. I blessed every room and doorway, inside and outside, and left a Bible with the client open on Psalm 23. To cut a long story short, I had to bless the house, you guessed it, 5 times comprehensively before activity stopped. I was considering escalating to the Archbishop, but the client was hesitant because once the church is involved, I, the chaplain, have no control over what happens next. And sometimes they can be forceful with their interventions. When I was a kid, I lived in an old, run-down farmhouse and had experienced so many strange as well as scary encounters. So I was laying in bed thinking about a time where I was physically attacked by one and how that's even possible. This takes place in a city house, not a farmhouse. I was a lot older, around 16, and I lived in my grandparents' house with my dad. Backstory on grandparents is needed. So my grandpa and grandma were super religious, Christians, and my grandpa would talk about his childhood to me. He said his parents were religious, and he hated it. He rebelled severely and dabbled into satanic stuff. Through his teens, he experienced items being thrown with intense force at him, his bed violently shaking, and just straight up torment from what he said were demons. He said he found God through all that because a light that he called a guardian angel saved him from the terrors he experienced. Anyway, back to when I lived with them. It wasn't the same house he experienced that, and they had crosses over every doorframe and tons of religious stuff around the house for protection. A side thing I experienced in this house to set the feeling something wasn't right is that one day my dad randomly walks into my room, really annoyed, and says, "What?" I was so confused and asked what he meant. He said I called him and then wasn't responding when he said what the first time, so he came in. I was watching YouTube on my headphones, so my room was dead silent, and when I kept persisting, I didn't. He looked so pale and scared. He said he 100% heard my voice call out to him. This happened 3 times in that house in different locations to different family members. We would hear a mimic essentially, which is terrifying, if you experienced it before you know. So the physical incident. It was around Halloween, and I remember so clearly. I was standing in the doorway of the kitchen and talking to my grandma, who was cutting apples. We were talking about how candy apples are unsafe for trick or treating treats because of razor blades, when all of a sudden I feel a super hard shove on my left shoulder, hard enough to throw my body forward off balance. I was petrified, to be honest. I looked behind me, and no one was there. I tried to convince myself maybe my hood on my hoodie fell, and I overreacted. I looked at my grandma and she was just staring at me. I asked her, "Did you not just see me get pushed like there was someone behind me?" And she just continued staring while saying nothing and then turned away and continued cutting the apples. She had such a blank expression. I feel like she knows what happened but ignored it as a way to cope because maybe this happens a lot. Thinking back, maybe it was pushing me out from under the cross? I don't know, but I think that was the most horrifying encounter I ever had because, although all my other experiences were scary and caused my body to react when I heard ghost stories, this was the only physical encounter I had, and I'm so glad I moved out fast. Grandpa definitely has demons that never left from when he was a kid. I am female, and I was 23 at the time of this story. These events took place in 2010, and I finally thought it was time to share the story of the horrifying events I went through with the demon in the basement. At the time, I had been on the lookout for a new place to live, as my roommate had a cat, and I could no longer deal with my allergies. When I moved in with her, I was living in a dingy motel room, so having a roommate in a proper house was a serious upgrade. I thought the cat wouldn't be too much of an issue, but it was not to be. Being an animal lover, I could never even think about suggesting to someone to get rid of a beloved pet, so I opted to move out instead. I had been searching for a new place for a couple of weeks when I came across an ad on Craigslist describing a room for rent on a waterfront property. It was surprisingly affordable, and I was very intrigued. There were no photos on the add-on, but the address was pretty close by. So, I drove over to the place to take a look, and the property was beautiful. It definitely looked lived in and well maintained. So I called the number on the ad later that afternoon to make an inquiry. This is when I first came across Crazy Patty. At first, she seemed extremely friendly on the phone. We laughed and joked and got along very well. She said she would be delighted to meet me and to come around anytime to view the property and the room for rent. So I made an appointment for the next day. I pulled up in the driveway and was greeted by Patty waving warmly at me from the front porch. She was a middle-aged woman, in her 40s, she had a kind of hippie-ish clothing style, she wore thick glasses and had long, frizzy brown hair. She was shorter than me by a couple of inches, and she spoke in a kind of nasally, baby voice. Now before I continue, I would like to give a little background on the women of my family. We are all gifted in the spiritual realm. The gift can be traced back to my great-great-grandmother, who could read tea leaves. She was extremely gifted and did readings for her entire life, until one day when she finished her tea and read her son's death. Needless to say, she never read tea leaves again. Since then, the women on my mother's side have inherited some kind of special gift. Whether it is clairvoyance, clairsentience, or something of that nature. Funnily enough, no one since my great-great-grandmother has had the ability to read tea leaves. I was fortunate, or unlucky, enough to be a clairvoyant. Meaning I can see, hear, and even smell things from the spirit world. These things happen very rarely to me, and at this point I just considered my abilities a bit of an annoying quirk and had not yet accepted them as part of who I am. Even though I was aware of my gifts in the spirit world, I was still a very skeptical person, and I always tried, and even wanted, to find rational explanations for things before I came to any conclusions about any kind of spiritual activity. Before these events, I had never experienced any kind of malevolent or demonic being. Since my phone conversation with Patty had gone so well, I was expecting us to get along just as well in real life. As I walked up the stairs of the porch to shake her hand, I immediately noticed her eyes. I can't fully explain how they looked, only that they were off. She said how nice it was to meet me and shook my hand. I immediately got icy chills down my spine. I managed to smile and said that it was great to meet her too. She took me inside, and, to be fair, the house was beautiful. It had a massive living room with huge skylights, and there were lush plants everywhere. The kitchen was ultra-modern and sparkling clean. There was also a huge, 2-story deck out back, fully kitted out with furniture, a bar, and a fire pit. The deck opened out to a private beach on a lake. I immediately fell in love with the house. Patty took me downstairs to the finished basement, where the room for rent was located. The basement consisted of 4 rooms, a large living room with a pool table, a bathroom, a smaller living room, and a bedroom. The rooms for rent were the bedroom and the smaller living room. Apart from being a little dark and without a huge amount of light, the rooms for rent were lovely. They were clean and fully furnished. Patty was extremely nice to me, and she seemed very excited to show me around. But something still seemed off about her. Despite the uneasiness I felt, I decided that I loved the house, and the next day we went through all the relevant paperwork. I paid my deposit, and before you know it, I was all moved in. At the time, I had no family where I lived. One side of my family was in Europe, where I had just moved from at the beginning of the summer, or all the way down on the southern part of the US. So, I felt a little lonely, but I was optimistic. Patty worked during the day, and I worked at night at a bar, so we rarely saw each other. At first, this arrangement was perfect. And I was settling in nicely. I had no issues until one night, about a week in, I decided to cook myself dinner. I had a night off, my first since moving in with Patty, and I was dying to use the gorgeous kitchen. Growing up, I was always taught to clean as I go, so I did just that. I heard Patty's key in the front door and greeted her as she walked into the kitchen. My smile faltered as I saw the expression on her face. She looked angry, and she shouted at me, "What the hell are you doing?" Her brow was furrowed, and her lips were pulled back in a snarl. I was completely shocked, and my body froze for a moment before I answered shakily that I was just cooking dinner. I tried to appease her by offering some, but she swelled like an angry toad and screamed that I had destroyed her kitchen. Now my dinner was fairly simple, and I had been cleaning as I went along, The only thing that was dirty was one pan, which was already soaking in soapy water. I explained that I obviously had every intention of cleaning it up, but she screeched again, stomped down the hall, and slammed her bedroom door. I quickly cleaned up everything and made sure the place was spotless before taking my plate down to my bedroom and eating down there so I didn't run into her again. After that, things just got worse. Patty was no longer friendly to me and looked at me like I was just a gross insect that she longed to squash. I tried desperately to look for somewhere else to live, but I lived in a tourist area, and it was a seasonal town. It was coming into winter, and many businesses had shut down and residents moved out of state. I could find nowhere else to rent that was affordable. I even contacted my old roommate, but because of a sudden family issue, she moved back in with her parents. I kept looking for weeks but found nothing. As the weeks went by, it became apparent that Patty didn't want me there. She wanted no trace of a roommate in her house. She wanted to collect the money, and that was it. I tried to stay out of her way by doing my household chores and emerging from the basement when she was out of the house. On my nights off, I went into work to eat dinner, so I didn't have to use the kitchen. I made sure to only buy microwave dinners for the nights I couldn't afford to eat out. Every time I had to come upstairs and Patty was there, I would be met with her intense glare with those eyes that continued to be off somehow. At this point in time, my living situation had started to affect me physically. I was constantly exhausted, my skin was paler, and I became very skittish. It was after this change in me started to take hold that things in the basement started happening. Things would go missing and then turn up. At first, I just put this down to forgetfulness, which I am prone to. But one day something happened that made me incredibly uneasy. See, I always kept my work shoes in a specific spot when I came downstairs. I had been called in for a day shift last minute, and I was getting my uniform on. On my way out, I went to grab my shoes, but they weren't there. Now, this was something I was not forgetful about. I always kept my shoes in this specific spot because Patty didn't want me dirtying up the carpet. I went upstairs to check and see if I had left them up there, and I hadn't. I looked everywhere for them, and I couldn't find them anywhere. Not putting it past Patty to do something mean like take my shoes, I went back downstairs to grab a different pair only to stop dead in my tracks. Right there in their normal spot were my shoes. My heart leapt out of my chest. What was going on? I knew I was forgetful at times, but they definitely weren't there a minute ago, were they? There had to be an explanation. Patty was at work, so I knew it wasn't her, and it was at that moment that a thought crept into my mind. Was there someone else in the house? Terrified, I grabbed my shoes and ran upstairs. I grabbed my keys and immediately left the house, locking the door behind me. I wondered if I should call the police, but what would I tell them? That I found my work shoes right where I left them? I thought about telling Patty, but the thought of telling her that something had bothered me like that would only give her ammunition to torment me further. So, I didn't tell anyone. After work, I came home to Patty eating her dinner, and a mess in the kitchen. Luckily, I had the foresight to grab some food to go from the bar, so I crept in as quietly as possible and just went downstairs to eat, as I always did. I turned on the light in my room, and for a split second I thought I had seen a dark figure in the far corner of the room. I did a double take, my heart pounding. I had to be going nuts. The stress in this place was starting to make me hallucinate. Satisfied but still a little uneasy with my explanation, I turned on my TV and began to eat my dinner. As I ate, I was still convinced I saw flutters of movement coming from that corner of the room, just out of sight. But every time I looked, there was nothing. This mysterious figure would start making regular appearances out of the corner of my eye, but again, when I tried looking, there would be nothing there. I thought I was losing my mind, and I became even more withdrawn. It was after a few months of this happening that the dream started. I would be having a perfectly normal dream, then all of a sudden, I would have the feeling of being strangled by a faceless man. I would be fighting him off, and I would always wake myself up by screaming. I would wake up sweating, and my heart would be pounding. The worst part was, my throat would be sore, and I never knew if I had really been screaming or not. I would like to think that if I were, Patty would run down. But that was unlikely. I would start out having these dreams about once or twice a month, then as it came closer into the fall of the following year, they started happening more regularly. Once a week, twice a week, every other day. I was feeling completely broken down mentally, emotionally, and physically. I was a shell of my former self. At this point you are probably wondering why I stayed at Crazy Patty's house for as long as I did. Well, for those of you who have never experienced emotional and mental abuse, consider yourself lucky. It is extremely powerful. Patty used a variety of techniques, including manipulation, intimidation, and gaslighting, to ensure I stayed where I was. She hated me there, but she wanted the money. She literally had me convinced that I wouldn't find anywhere else as nice as her place for the price I was paying. And that no one would put up with me anyway. Up until this point, I had not considered my unsettling experiences at Patty's house to be demonic. I had put them down to a side effect of being so stressed and beaten down. Until one night. As usual, I had eaten my dinner out of a to-go box in my bedroom. I was sitting on my bed with my laptop in my lap. I had been watching some funny videos online when, all of a sudden, I couldn't take a breath. I felt like my chest was being constricted by an invisible vice grip. I went to move my hands up to my throat to check for a swelling or something, but I couldn't move my arms. I was completely paralyzed. It was then that I finally saw the figure in the corner. Its face was covered with a hood, but it lifted its head just enough for me to catch a glimpse of its face. Its eyes were huge and bulbous, much like the milky, pupilless eyes of an anglerfish. It had no other features except for those eyes and that smile. That toothy smile, full of uneven and rotten teeth, a smile that extended beyond the boundaries of its face. Think of Fred from that seriously creepy episode of Courage the Cowardly Dog. My heart stopped, and as soon as I saw this figure full on, it disappeared. I finally understood what was happening. I was being attacked. Somehow, I fought the pressure, and it subsided. This ordeal couldn't have lasted for longer than 10 seconds or so, but it felt like much longer. I was finally able to draw a breath, and I lay on my bed, panting as if I had just been drowning. I immediately jumped up and dug into my junk drawer. I found a few white candles, some sage, and a few crystals. I lit the white candles for protection, I lit the sage to purify the room, and I kept my crystals in my hand. Needless to say, I did not sleep much that night. After this incident, I continued to keep sage lighting at all times when I was in the room awake. And things settled down for a while. It wasn't until Halloween night that the crescendo of my experience peaked. Cliché, I know, but think about it. It was, and still is, believed that the veil to the spirit world is at its thinnest on All Hallows Eve, making it easier for spirits to enter our world. I had been working that night and had gotten home around 1 a.m. Exhausted, I fell right to sleep, only to get that strangling sensation some hours later. But this time it felt different. This time, it felt more real. In my dream, the entity that was attacking me grabbed me by the throat. In the past, I had not seen its face while it was doing this. I finally got a full-on view of its face. I could see the cracks on its rotten teeth, I could see the pale blood vessels in its grotesque eyes, and I could smell its rotten breath. I felt a scream coming, but I couldn't get it out. In my dream, I fought and fought, desperately trying to escape its grasp. It picked me up by my throat and slammed me into the wall behind me. I kept fighting it with all my might until I finally woke up. I was sweating and panting, and tears were streaming down my face. I looked at the clock, it was only 3 a.m. But as soon as I looked at the clock, my blood frozen in my veins. Not because it was 3 a.m., the traditional witching hour, but it was then I realized that I was not laying in my bed, I was sitting up against the wall. I leapt out of bed and ran into the bathroom. Afraid I was going to be sick. Luckily my stomach held, and I ended up splashing some cold water on my face. It was only when I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror that I had to stifle a scream. My neck was bruised and scratched. Like I had been strangled. Without even thinking about how late it was, I called my boss in absolute hysterics. The bar I worked at was attached to a hotel, and I pleaded with him to let me sleep in one of the rooms that night. He did, and I decided right then and there that I would be moving out of Crazy Patty's house. I arrived back the next day to pack up what few belongings I had. After I had everything all packed up, I noticed her bedroom door was open. This was highly unusual, as she always kept it locked when she wasn't there. Thinking maybe her car was in the shop and she was in there, I went over to tell her I was leaving. But she wasn't in there. I went to close the door when something on the floor caught my eye. Normally it is out of character for me to snoop in someone else's room, but something in my gut just told me to check out what it was that caught my eye. On the floor was a planchette that had been broken in half, with the glass shattered all over the floor. The glint of the glass is what caught my eye. And on the other side of the room was a board. The Ouija board. It finally clicked that it had been Patty that set this entity on me, and I stormed out. I was fiddling with my house key, trying to get it off my keychain to leave it on the counter with a note I had left her, when I noticed movement on the deck outside. I looked up and was absolutely horrified to see Patty standing on the other side of the glass door, staring right at me completely naked. She had her hands on the glass and seemed to be pressing her face right against the glass. It was then that I noticed her eyes. Her eyes had always been off to me, but I finally understood why. Instead of her usual, slightly off eyes, staring right back at me were the milky bulbous eyes of the entity. I quickly turned around, ran to my car, and tore out of the driveway and never returned. Things got better after that. My anxiety subsided, my face filled out again, and I started to be a lot more social. After a few weeks, I moved into an apartment with 2 girls I worked with and got along very well with. I never saw Crazy Patty again. As of telling this story, almost 12 years have passed, and I am no longer easily beaten down by manipulation tactics. I have become a lot more assertive and will not tolerate any attempt to deceive or manipulate me. I have also been practicing white magic in the form of plants and cooking and have embraced my clairvoyance as part of who I am. I am happy to say that I have never experienced anything like I did at Crazy Patty's house. If I get even a whiff of a negative entity, I get the hell out of Dodge. Stat. All in all, I am a much healthier, stronger, and happier person than I was all those years ago. But late at night, I still get the horrifying image of Patty staring into my soul with the dead eyes of the demon in the basement.